Randy Meisner was more than just a quiet eagle with a soaring voice. Behind his angelic harmonies and timeless ballads lay a life filled with betrayal, scandal, and tragedy that few ever truly understood. From the Nebraska farmlands to the glittering stages of the world, his story was one of meteoric rise and heartbreaking collapse. But fame wasn't the end of Randy's story. Whispers of missing recordings, rumors of secret diaries, strange misfortunes that seemed to haunt him, and even a tragic family death that left more questions than answers, all fed into what fans began calling the Meisner curse. And when the news broke of his passing in 2023, the official explanation seemed simple: complications from illness. Yet, even in death, rumors spread of missing memorabilia, unanswered questions, and shadows that suggested the mystery of Randy Meisner's life didn't end when he left this world. What was the truth behind his silence? What really happened in those dark corners of his story that history tried to bury? This is the rise and fall, and the unresolved legacy of Randy Meisner. Randy Meisner's story begins far from the spotlight in the quiet farmlands of Scottsbluff, Nebraska. Born in 1946 to a family of Volga German farmers, Randy grew up surrounded by endless rows of corn, beans, alfalfa, and sugar beets. Life on the plains was simple but demanding, and while most children his age were expected to inherit the farming lifestyle, Randy's world was already colored by music. His mother filled the house with song, and his grandfather gave violin lessons to the local children. Music wasn't a formal pursuit in his family, it was part of the air he breathed. By the age of 10, everything changed when Randy sat in front of the family television and saw Elvis Presley performing on The Ed Sullivan Show. The raw energy and charisma of the king of rock and roll lit a spark that would burn for the rest of his life. Randy begged his parents for a guitar, and though money was tight, he began teaching himself by ear, never relying on lessons or sheet music. His early self-taught style gave him a raw authenticity that later became one of his trademarks as a musician. In high school, fate stepped in with a surprising twist. A teacher noticed Randy's natural rhythm and suggested he switch from guitar to bass, an instrument most teenagers avoided because it rarely stood in the spotlight. But Randy took the advice, and what seemed like a small decision would set him on the path to becoming one of rock's most distinctive bassists. Unlike many of his peers, he didn't just play bass lines, he wove emotion into every note, combining R&B influences with the warmth of country melodies. Soon he joined a local group called the Drive-In Dynamics, his first real taste of performance beyond the family home. The band quickly became popular at school dances and small-town gatherings, with Randy's energy and vocals catching the attention of Nebraska youth. In 1962, they recorded their first EP, which included a cover of Sam Cooke's You Send Me, with Randy on lead vocals. The recording was raw, unpolished, but deeply heartfelt, a sound that resonated across local radio stations and earned him a growing reputation as the boy with the golden voice. By the mid-1960s, Randy's ambitions were clear. Farming was never his destiny, and he knew the plains couldn't contain his dream. When the Drive-In Dynamics signed a deal with Sully Records and released the single So Fine in 1965, it gave Randy his first real taste of professional music. The record didn't catapult him to fame, but it gave him something more important: a door into the larger world of rock and roll. From that moment, Randy Meisner wasn't just a boy from Nebraska. He was a young artist chasing the horizon, preparing to leave behind the safety of home for the wild chaos of Los Angeles. When Randy arrived in Los Angeles in 1966, the city was already in the middle of a cultural earthquake. The Sunset Strip buzzed with the sound of psychedelic guitars, smoky clubs were filled with dreamers and drifters, and music was becoming the heartbeat of an entire generation. For a young man from Nebraska, it was both overwhelming and electrifying. Randy wasn't just chasing fame, he was chasing belonging in a city where the rules of music were being rewritten every night. His first real break came when he joined a group called The Poor, sometimes billed as the Soul Survivors. Though the band never cracked the mainstream, it was Randy's introduction to the professional circuits of Los Angeles. They played gritty clubs, cut a few singles, and even landed the surreal experience of opening for Jimi Hendrix at the Salvation Club in New York. Imagine that, a kid from the plains now sharing a bill with one of the greatest guitarists who ever lived. For Randy, it was proof that he had crossed the threshold into something bigger than himself. But with every opportunity came heartbreak. In 1968, Randy co-founded Poco, a band that would later be seen as a cornerstone of country rock. His fingerprints were all over their first album, Picking Up the Pieces. He wrote songs, laid down bass lines, and poured himself into the project. Yet when the record was finally released, Randy's photo on the cover had been replaced, not by another band member, but by a picture of a dog. The exclusion stung deeply. To make matters worse, he wasn't even allowed in the mixing sessions. Randy would later confess that betrayal like this left scars that never fully healed. He had given everything to the group, only to be pushed aside at the very moment of triumph. The betrayal didn't just hurt professionally, it shaped Randy's personality in ways that followed him for decades. He became cautious, sensitive, and wary of conflict. Where others might have fought back or demanded control, Randy's instinct was to retreat, to internalize the pain, and to let it fester quietly. Those early years in Los Angeles weren't just about building a career, they were about learning the brutal politics of the music industry. After leaving Poco, Randy returned briefly to Nebraska, questioning whether the music world was worth the heartache. But the pull of Los Angeles was too strong, and soon he was back, this time joining Rick Nelson's Stone Canyon Band in 1969. Here, Randy found temporary refuge, playing bass and singing harmonies on Nelson's albums. He even co-wrote I Want to Be With You for Nelson's Garden Party album. Performing with Nelson gave him credibility, but it also reminded him of a nagging truth. No matter how much he contributed, Randy often remained in the shadows of more dominant personalities. These early chapters were filled with near misses and lingering doubts. He was talented enough to brush shoulders with legends, but fragile enough to feel like an outsider even within his own bands. Betrayal and exclusion had left their mark, and by the time the 1970s dawned, Randy Meisner was still chasing recognition. He had been a farm boy, a local hero, a nearly forgotten side player, and now a journeyman musician, but his story was only beginning, because destiny was about to place him in the center of one of the greatest rock bands the world had ever known. By 1971, fate brought Randy Meisner into the orbit of three names that would soon define an era: Glenn Frey, Don Henley, and Bernie Leadon. All four had been working as backing musicians for Linda Ronstadt, honing their sound under the guidance of David Geffen and the freshly minted Asylum Records. What began as a side project quickly transformed into something far greater. Together, they formed the Eagles, a band destined to change American music forever. From the very beginning, Randy's voice was indispensable. His high harmonies gave the Eagles their unique, soaring sound, layered, emotional, and instantly recognizable. Songs like Take the Devil and Is It True carried his imprint, while his bass work anchored the band's mix of country twang and rock drive. Yet, it was his performance on Take It to the Limit that would etch him permanently into music history. The haunting ballad, with its impossibly high note in the chorus, became one of the band's defining moments and one of Randy's greatest burdens. Night after night, audiences demanded the song as the encore, and Randy was expected to deliver. At first, the applause and adoration felt like validation, but as touring wore on, the pressure became unbearable. Singing that high note wasn't just difficult, it was punishing. Randy was often sick, exhausted, and battling the toll of endless travel. Yet Glenn Frey insisted the song was non-negotiable. To the fans, Randy was the man with the angelic voice. Behind the curtain, he was a man cracking under the weight of expectation. Meanwhile, tensions inside the band grew sharper. Don Henley and Glenn Frey took complete control of the band's songwriting and management, leaving Randy increasingly sidelined. His introverted personality clashed with their assertive leadership. While the Eagles transitioned from a country rock sound into a harder-edged, stadium-filling rock machine, Randy felt himself slipping further from the center. He was praised in public, but isolated in private, a silent rift that was widening with every album. Still, Randy's influence was undeniable. His harmonies shaped classics like One of These Nights, and his soft-spoken nature provided a counterbalance to the egos dominating the band. Fans adored him, but few realized the cost of his contributions. For Randy, being an Eagle meant living two lives: the celebrated performer whose voice carried millions into the stratosphere, and the weary man who felt like an outsider in the very band he helped create. The seeds of conflict had already been sown, and soon they would explode in a way that would change his life forever. By the summer of 1977, Randy Meisner was at his breaking point. Years of touring had taken a brutal toll. Stomach ulcers, flu symptoms, and the sheer exhaustion of living on the road had drained his spirit. Yet the pressure never relented. Every night, fans demanded Take It to the Limit, and every night Randy was expected to push his fragile voice to its very limit. What had once been his proudest achievement now felt like a punishment he couldn't escape. On June 28, 1977, in Knoxville, Tennessee, the pressure finally boiled over. That night, Randy was too ill to perform the encore. He told the band he couldn't deliver the high note, and for him, it was a simple plea for rest. But to Glenn Frey, it was an act of defiance. Frey lashed out, furious that Randy had let the audience down. The argument escalated backstage into a violent confrontation that required police intervention. It wasn't just a clash of personalities, it was the eruption of years of pent-up resentment and imbalance within the band. For Randy, the humiliation of that night was the final straw. He finished the show in near isolation, his presence on stage more symbolic than real. Shortly afterward, he made the decision to leave the Eagles entirely. "I chose sanity over money," he later admitted in an interview, a short but devastating statement that captured the truth of his struggle. The fame, the applause, the millions of dollars, it all meant nothing if his mental and physical health were destroyed in the process. The press painted Randy as the fragile eagle, the quiet one who cracked under pressure. But the truth was far more complex. His departure was not about weakness, it was about survival. He had spent years contributing some of the most beautiful harmonies and melodies in rock history, only to feel pushed to the margins by the band's dominant leaders. Knoxville wasn't just the scene of a fight, it was the moment the world saw how fractured the Eagles had truly become. When Randy walked away, it was the end of an era. The Eagles continued without him, soaring into superstardom, while Randy stepped into an uncertain future. Fans mourned the loss of the voice behind Take It to the Limit, and though the headlines called it exhaustion, insiders knew better. Randy Meisner had been driven out, not just by illness, but by the relentless machine of fame that demanded more than any one man could give. After Randy's departure from the Eagles, the official story was simple: exhaustion, illness, and creative differences. But in the shadows of the music world, whispers began to circulate that his exit was only the beginning of something far stranger. Rock magazines and gossip columns hinted at a dark undercurrent, what some began to call the Meisner curse. According to rumors, anyone who crossed paths with Randy in the Eagles' orbit seemed to fall victim to sudden misfortune, bizarre accidents, or unexplained setbacks. Whether coincidence or something more, the narrative of Randy as a man haunted by unseen forces began to take shape. One of the most persistent stories was the existence of a black diary. Allegedly, Randy kept meticulous notes about secret contracts, backstage scandals, and even the chaotic private lives of his bandmates. If true, it was dynamite, evidence that could have shaken the band's carefully polished image. But no one ever produced the diary, and its supposed contents remained in the realm of rumor. Some claimed it was destroyed, others swore it was hidden away in a private collection, traded quietly for cash. The mystery only deepened with time. Then came the strange case of the missing master tape of Take It to the Limit. At the height of the band's success, the original recording reportedly vanished without a trace. Whispers spread that Randy himself had sold it to a collector for an enormous sum, while others insisted it was stolen as revenge for his departure. The truth was never uncovered, and the disappearance only fueled the idea that Randy's life was surrounded by inexplicable twists of fate. Compounding the rumors were accounts of bizarre misfortunes. At a Laurel Canyon party, Randy was supposedly at the center of an unsettling ritual that later ended in chaos. Soon after, his car was vandalized, and his passport mysteriously disappeared just days before a major tour. A former lighting technician even went on television, claiming he saw Randy exchanging documents backstage with a reporter, hinting at blackmail or sabotage from within the band itself. Each story on its own might have been dismissed as gossip, but together they painted a picture of a man entangled in a web of secrets he could never escape. By the late 1970s, Randy Meisner had become more than a former band member. He was a symbol. To fans, he was the voice they loved and lost. To the press, he was a figure of scandal and suspicion. And to his critics, he was the outsider who carried bad luck wherever he went. Whether the so-called Meisner curse was real or imagined, it cast a shadow over his career and left an unsettling question in the air. Was Randy the victim of circumstance, or was there always more to his story than anyone dared to admit? When Randy Meisner stepped away from the Eagles, many expected him to rise again as a solo artist. After all, he had the voice, the reputation, and the fan base. In 1978, he released his self-titled debut solo album. The record carried flashes of his signature style, warm harmonies, heartfelt lyrics, and polished bass work. But something was missing. Critics described it as inconsistent, and Randy himself later admitted he felt it lacked focus. Without the Eagles machine behind him, the album barely made a dent on the charts. 2 years later, Randy tried again with one more song. This time, he struck closer to the heart. The single Hearts on Fire reached the top 20, and his duet with Kim Carnes, Deep Inside My Heart, became a modest hit. For a brief moment, it seemed Randy was carving out a new identity, no longer the sidelined Eagle, but a star in his own right. Still, the momentum quickly faded. By 1982, his third solo album, also self-titled, peaked at only number 94 in the US. The dream of a sustained solo career slipped through his fingers, overshadowed by changing trends in the music industry. The struggles weren't just professional, they were deeply personal. Randy was battling inner demons that grew louder as the spotlight dimmed. His gentle, introverted nature made the grind of self-promotion unbearable, and he often withdrew rather than push forward. Friends and colleagues described him as someone plagued by insecurities, forever haunted by the betrayals of his early career. The same sensitivity that gave his voice its beauty also left him vulnerable in a business that thrived on confrontation. His personal life was no refuge. Randy's marriage to Jennifer Barton, which had begun in 1963, unraveled after nearly 2 decades, leaving him with 3 children and a fractured sense of stability. While he remarried years later, his second marriage would be marked by its own storms. Behind the scenes, alcohol and erratic behavior began to surface, setting the stage for the darker battles he would face in the decades ahead. By the mid-1980s, Randy's name was fading from the headlines. Projects like the Roberts Meisner Band and brief reunions with Poco never gained traction. His music career, once filled with limitless promise, seemed stuck in a cycle of near misses and disappointments. For fans, it was heartbreaking to watch. For Randy, it was even worse. He was a man who had touched the heights of rock stardom, only to find himself slipping into obscurity while his old bandmates cemented their place as legends. By the mid-2010s, Randy Meisner was no longer known for his music, but for the crises surrounding his personal life. In 2015, longtime friend James Newton filed for guardianship, citing alarming behavior. Randy was described as suffering from bipolar disorder, alcoholism, and suicidal thoughts, with episodes where he lost control completely. Court documents painted a picture of a fragile man unable to care for himself, a heartbreaking fall for someone once seen as the soaring voice of a generation. Amid this storm came a tragedy that stunned both fans and the media. On March 6, 2016, Randy's second wife, Lana Ray Meisner, died from a gunshot wound inside their Los Angeles home. The police report concluded it was an accident. Lana had been moving a rifle stored in its case when it snagged on something and discharged. Hours before, however, officers had been called to the house over a domestic dispute. The eerie timing fueled suspicion. How could a heated argument and a sudden fatal accident occur so close together without deeper connections? The media immediately seized on the contradictions. TMZ, ABC, and CBS reported on the official police ruling, but also highlighted troubling details. Friends claimed Lana often feared for her safety, even locking her bedroom door at night. Meanwhile, court records revealed Randy's unstable mental health and guardianship status, raising questions about whether his household had been a powder keg waiting to explode. The tragedy was officially closed as an accident, but many refused to accept such a simple answer. Rumors only grew darker. Some claimed that evidence vanished overnight. Security footage, personal notes, even items from the home reportedly disappeared before investigators could collect them. Others pointed to the infamous whispers of Randy's Black Diary and the so-called Meisner curse, suggesting that Lana's death was another chapter in a legacy of chaos that followed him everywhere. To his supporters, Randy was a grieving husband trapped in a nightmare. To skeptics, he was a man whose life seemed surrounded by too many unresolved mysteries. The tragedy marked the beginning of Randy's final decline. Already weakened by illness and fragile mental health, Lana's death pushed him deeper into isolation. He accepted court-appointed guardians to manage his finances and medical decisions, effectively surrendering control of his own life. For fans, the news was devastating. The gentle voice who once carried "Take It to the Limit" was now a broken man at the center of a family disaster. For Randy himself, it was the closing of a door he would never be able to reopen. In the years following Lana's death, Randy Meisner disappeared almost entirely from public life. Once a figure on some of the world's largest stages, he now lived quietly under the supervision of court-appointed guardians who managed his medical and financial affairs. For fans, it was heartbreaking to watch one of the most recognizable voices in American rock reduced to silence. For Randy, it was a retreat from the chaos that had consumed so much of his life. His health, already fragile, continued to deteriorate. Randy had battled chronic obstructive pulmonary disease since the early 2000s, a condition worsened by years of smoking and the wear of constant touring in his younger days. Combined with his struggles with bipolar disorder and alcoholism, the illness left him frail and confined. Invitations to reunite with the Eagles, like the band's History of the Eagles tour in 2013, had to be declined. He only made rare appearances, such as at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction in 1998, moments that now seemed like distant memories. On July 26, 2023, the news broke. Randy Meisner had died in Los Angeles at the age of 77. The official statement cited complications from COPD as the cause. Tributes poured in immediately. Fellow Eagles members remembered him as the soft-spoken soul whose harmonies had carried their earliest hits. Rolling Stone and countless music outlets honored his voice on "Take It to the Limit," calling it one of the most unforgettable ballads in American rock. Fans across the world mourned not just the loss of a musician, but the loss of a man whose gentle presence had left a permanent mark on music history. Yet, as with so many parts of Randy's life, even his death was not free from mystery. Fans and insiders began whispering about strange gaps in the story. Why did reports of missing memorabilia suddenly surface after his passing? Why were there quiet disputes over his estate, despite years of guardianship supposedly keeping everything in order? On music forums, some speculated that the Meisner curse had followed him to the very end, that his final days, like so many chapters before, held unanswered questions. While COPD was the official explanation, the sense of something unresolved lingered in the air. In the end, Randy Meisner left behind a legacy of both brilliance and mystery. Over 200 million Eagles albums sold worldwide carried his harmonies, his bass lines, and his voice. Songs like "Take It to the Limit" remain etched in the memory of generations. Yet alongside the glory were shadows, the betrayals, the scandals, the tragedies, and the haunting suspicion that not every truth had been told. Even in death, Randy's story feels incomplete. A reminder that some legacies are defined not only by the music we hear, but by the secrets that remain forever untold. Randy Meisner's story is a haunting mix of light and shadow. On one side, he was the Nebraska farm boy who rose to co-found one of the greatest bands in American history. His voice on Take It to the Limit became a timeless anthem, a song that still gives chills decades after it was first sung. His harmonies helped define the sound of the Eagles, shaping a musical legacy that will outlive us all. But on the other side, his life was tangled in betrayal, relentless pressure, and tragedies that defied simple explanation. From being replaced on an album cover by a dog, to walking away from the Eagles at their peak, to whispers of black diaries and missing tapes, Randy's path was never free of shadows. Even in his later years, the tragedy of his wife's death and the strange questions surrounding his own passing left the sense of a life never fully understood. Was it coincidence, bad luck, or was there truly something darker, an invisible weight, a so-called Meisner curse that followed him from stage to grave? We may never know. What we do know is that Randy's legacy is split between the soaring beauty of his music and the unsettling mysteries that continue to spark debate long after his death. Perhaps that's the truest mark of his story. Randy Meisner was never just a voice. He was a puzzle, a man whose life leaves us with as many questions as it does unforgettable songs. His legacy forces us to look past the glamour of rock stardom and ask how much darkness hides behind the spotlight. If you want to keep exploring the untold stories and hidden scandals behind music legends, don't forget to subscribe and tell us in the comments what part of Randy Meisner's life shocked you the most.